The morning her mother was buried, Sloane Whitfield watched her husband walk through the cemetery gates holding another woman's hand. Not discreetly, not with the decency of distance or the courtesy of shame. He walked in like he was arriving at a dinner party. Elliot in his charcoal Tom Ford suit, the woman beside him in a cream-wrapped dress that probably cost more than Sloane's first car, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her hand threaded through the crook of his arm like she had every right to be there. Like the woman in the ground had never existed. Like Sloane herself was nothing more than an inconvenient backdrop. Sloane felt the air leave her body. She was standing near the entrance of Meadowlawn Cemetery, between her mother's attorney, a quiet, silver-haired man named Mr. Hollis, and her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Octavia, who had been crying since 6 that morning and hadn't really stopped. The day was gray and cold, one of those February mornings that smells like wet stone, and Sloane had been holding herself very still, the way she'd been holding herself still for most of the past 8 years of her marriage. She saw Elliot register that she'd spotted him. She watched something move across his face. Not guilt, not remorse. Something more like calculation. A quick assessment. Then he lifted his chin, said something to the woman beside him, and they kept walking toward her. Sloane did not move. Her hands, both of them clasped around the strap of her black purse, did not shake. This was a thing she had become very good at. Not shaking. Not making a sound that would give anyone in the room, or the cemetery, or the marriage, the satisfaction of knowing she was breaking. Sloane. Elliot's voice, warm and practiced, the voice he used when he needed something. "I'm so sorry about your mother." He kissed her cheek. She let him. The woman stood slightly behind him, which was the only acknowledgement. Elliot offered that there was anything wrong with the situation. No introduction, no explanation, just a woman in a cream dress at a funeral she had no business attending, watching Sloane with the particular kind of pity that people reserve for those they've already decided have lost. Sloane looked at her once, only once. Then she looked back at her husband. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Because what else do you say? What else do you do standing over your mother's grave, when the man who was supposed to love you decides that this is the moment to stop pretending?" What you need to understand about Sloane Whitfield is that she was never loud about anything. She had grown up in a household built on restraint. Her mother, Caroline Whitfield, had been the kind of woman who believed that dignity was the only real currency, that how you carried yourself in difficult moments said everything about who you were. Caroline had been a quiet woman, too, but quietly formidable. She had built Whitfield Capital from a regional investment firm into a $400 million operation over 30 years, mostly by being the person in every room who said the least and understood the most. Sloane had inherited this from her. People sometimes mistook it for coldness. Elliot had never understood it at all. She had met him at a charity gala in Boston when she was 31. He was a venture consultant then, good-looking in the way of men who know they're good-looking and have arranged their entire personality around that fact. Charming in a way that felt effortless, because he'd been practicing it since childhood. He had pursued her with a focus that she had at the time mistaken for love. Her mother had not mistaken it. "He's very attentive," Caroline had said. The first time Sloane brought Elliot home to the Whitfield estate in Connecticut, it was the tone more than the words, the careful, uninflected delivery that Caroline reserved for things she disapproved of but had decided not to fight about. "Not yet. You don't like him," Sloane had said. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Caroline had looked at her daughter for a long moment. "I like him fine. I'm watching him." Sloane had thought she understood what that meant. She hadn't, entirely. They married 18 months later. Elliot became a managing partner at a firm that handled financial consulting. Respectable work, well compensated, though not at the level of what Sloane's family represented. This had never seemed to bother him openly. What bothered Elliot, Sloane came to understand over the years, was the waiting. He had expected that marrying into the Whitfield family would mean something more immediate. He had expected early access. Partnership in the traditional sense, not just of the marriage, but of the money. Caroline had given him neither. She had been unfailingly polite to him. She had included him in family events, acknowledged him at company dinners, treated him with the surface warmth she extended to everyone in her orbit. But the one time Elliot had raised the question of bringing him on in an advisory capacity at Whitfield Capital, over a dinner in the early years of the marriage, carefully framed, deliberately casual. Caroline had smiled at him and changed the subject so smoothly that it took him 3 minutes to realize she'd done it. He had never asked again. But he had not forgotten. Sloane knew all of this. She had known for years, if she was being honest with herself, exactly what shape her marriage was. She knew because she had found things. Small things at first. An unexplained receipt, a name she didn't recognize saved in his phone, a text message she'd glimpsed before he turned the screen away. She had confronted him once, early on. He had been masterful in his response. Wounded, articulate, genuinely convincing. She had let herself be convinced because the alternative, at 34, in a marriage that was supposed to be her life, had seemed impossible to look at directly. But she had begun watching him the way her mother had always watched him, quietly, without alerting him to what she saw. What she saw over the years accumulated into something she could no longer explain away. The business trips that landed on the same weeks as certain client dinners she'd attended alone. The way his warmth toward her shifted in direct proportion to whatever financial news had most recently come out of Whitfield Capital. The way he spoke about her mother, respectful on the surface, something harder underneath. The barely concealed impatience of a man watching an inheritance he felt entitled to remain stubbornly out of reach. She had not left him. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't know, but because she had understood, in the way her mother had taught her to understand things, that the timing of an action matters as much as the action itself. That patience is not passivity. That the quiet woman in the room is not always the one losing. Caroline Whitfield was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October. She died 4 months later, in February, with Sloane at her bedside and Elliot in a hotel in Chicago that he claimed was a work trip. He had come back 2 days before the funeral. He had been solicitous, helpful, appropriately grieved in public. He had handled a few logistical things, called the florist, confirmed the reception arrangements, with the efficient energy of a man who has been waiting for something and can now sense it arriving. Sloane had watched him do all of this and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly. She was grieving. Of course she was. The kind of grief that lives in your chest like a stone you can't put down. But something quieter and more specific. A kind of clarity. The thing she had been holding herself back from for 8 years was almost done holding her. The morning of the funeral, before she left for the cemetery, she had sat for a while in her mother's study at the Connecticut house. The room where Caroline had done her most important work, where the walls were lined with folders and ledgers and framed photographs of deals closed and partnerships made. Sloane sat at her mother's desk and let herself feel the full weight of the room, of what it represented, of the woman who had built it. There was an envelope on the desk addressed to her, in her mother's handwriting. Sloane had known it was there. She had left it there deliberately, not yet ready. She picked it up now and held it for a moment, then set it carefully in her purse. She would read it later, after. She had not yet told Elliot about the will. He had shown up at the cemetery with the woman in the cream dress, whose name, Sloane would later learn, was Bethany Cross, a marketing executive Elliot had been seeing for approximately 2 years. And he had done it with the particular boldness of a man who believed he had already won. This was what Sloane would think about later, when she had distance from it. He had brought Bethany to the funeral, not because he was careless, but because he thought it didn't matter anymore. The money was coming. The waiting was over. Whatever Sloane did now, cry, confront him, file for divorce, he was about to become a very wealthy man. And that calculation had made him reckless, had made him stupid, which was, as it turned out, exactly the kind of mistake her mother had been counting on him making. The service was beautiful, in the spare and dignified way Caroline would have wanted. The pastor spoke about her faith in people, her particular kind of generosity, not loud, not performative, but consistent and deep. Octavia got up and said something that made everyone laugh through tears. Sloane stood at the front and said a few words she had written the night before and could barely see through the film that kept rising in her eyes, though she didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of Elliot. She didn't. He sat 2 rows back. Bethany sat next to him. Several people noticed. Sloane could see it in their faces. The flicker of confusion, the glance toward her, the tight recalibration. No one said anything. This was a funeral. No one would say anything here, which was also, Sloane understood, what Elliot was counting on. The reading of the will took place the following afternoon at the offices of Hollis and Macready in Hartford, the firm that had handled Whitfield Capital's legal affairs for 20 years. Mr. Hollis, the silver-haired man who had stood beside Sloane at the cemetery, ran the proceedings with the calm, methodical manner of someone who has delivered news of this kind many times. and knows that the most important thing is to remain entirely unsurprised by whatever reaction follows. Elliot was there in a different suit, this one navy, looking precisely as composed as a man who has been rehearsing this moment for years. He sat beside Sloane with his hands clasped on the conference table, the very picture of a supportive husband attending to important family business. His attorney, he had brought his own attorney, which Sloane noted and did not comment on, sat to his left. Mr. Hollis began with the charitable bequests, a significant endowment to the community foundation Caroline had supported for decades, gifts to several former employees, a trust for Octavia's youngest granddaughter for education. Then he got to the main estate, the entirety of Caroline Whitfield's personal assets, including her primary residence at the Connecticut estate, her investment portfolio, and her 51% controlling interest in Whitfield Capital, with a combined valuation of approximately $400 million, is to be transferred to her daughter, Sloane Ann Whitfield, outright and in full. He paused. There are no other primary beneficiaries named in this document. Elliot's composure was very good. Sloane would give him that. A man with less practice at it would have reacted visibly. A sharp breath, a shift in posture, something. What she saw was a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. His attorney leaned in and said something quietly. Elliot nodded once. Mr. Hollis continued. Mrs. Whitfield, that is Caroline, added an amendment to the document in November of last year, which I will read in full. He adjusted his glasses. The amendment reads, I have given considerable thought to the question of joint marital assets as they may pertain to the inheritance herein. After careful reflection and consultation with counsel, I have structured this bequest to ensure that it remains the sole and separate property of my daughter, Sloane, in perpetuity, regardless of the current or future status of her marriage. This is not an oversight. It is a decision I have made with full knowledge of the circumstances and with complete confidence in my daughter's judgment. The room was quiet. Elliot's attorney cleared his throat. We'll need to review the language around separate property classification and any applicable. The document is quite clear, Mr. Hollis said pleasantly. We can certainly arrange a time for your team to review the full filing. But the structure has been in place since the amendment was executed in November, and it was done specifically to anticipate any claims of marital interest. Mrs. Whitfield was very thorough. He said Mrs. Whitfield with the faintest emphasis, meaning Caroline, meaning the woman who saw this coming. Sloane looked at her hands on the table. She had known some of this, not all of it. Her mother had been protective of the specifics, wanting, she had said once, to handle things in her own time and in her own way. But Sloane had understood the shape of it. She had understood it in October, when her mother had asked her to sit down in that study and had said, very calmly, I know what your marriage is, Sloane. I've known for a long time. I want to make sure that what I've built doesn't become a tool for someone who doesn't deserve it. What Sloane had not known, what she read that evening, finally opening the envelope her mother had left her, was the full scope of what Caroline had done, not just the will, the months of documentation, the private investigator's reports, neatly filed, covering a period of 3 years, the notes in her mother's handwriting, precise and unsentimental, cataloging the things she had observed in Elliot's behavior and the conclusions she had drawn. And at the end of the letter, in the last paragraph, in her mother's clear, even script, I didn't tell you everything I knew because I understood that the choice had to be yours. I never doubted you would make it. I only wanted to make sure that when you did, the ground would already be steady beneath your feet. I have tried, in whatever time I had left, to be the person who makes your footing solid. The rest is yours. Sloane filed for divorce 11 days after the will was read. Elliot's attorney made several attempts to argue that certain shared household assets constituted marital property subject to equitable distribution, which they did. A fact Sloane had discussed with her own attorney long before the will was read, because she was her mother's daughter, and she had learned to prepare the ground. The marital assets were divided according to the existing prenuptial agreement, which Elliot had signed 9 years ago and appeared to have largely forgotten about. The agreement, drafted at Caroline's insistence and her suggestion, was specific and airtight. Elliot received his investment accounts, the car, and his personal belongings. He received nothing from Whitfield Capital. He received nothing from the estate. His attorney filed 2 motions that went nowhere. Bethany Cross, as it turned out, left him before the divorce was finalized. This was not something Sloane had arranged or anticipated. though she was honest enough with herself to note that she did not feel badly about it. What she felt, mostly, in those months, the long months of paperwork and logistics and the specific exhaustion of dismantling a life, was something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly. Not the bright, hot satisfaction she might have imagined, standing in that cemetery watching Elliot walk through the gate with another woman's hand in his. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a long-held breath being released, of a door she'd been bracing shut for years, finally being allowed to close properly, from the outside, with her on the right side of it. She moved back to the Connecticut house in April. She had not lived there since her 20s, and the return felt strange, and then, gradually, not strange at all. She walked through her mother's study on a Sunday morning in early spring, when the light was coming through the windows at a low angle and landing on the desk in that particular golden dust way it always had, and she sat down in her mother's chair and put her hands flat on the surface of the desk. She stayed there for a long time. There are things that Sloane understood about her mother that she had not fully understood while Caroline was alive. She understood now that the patience her mother had modeled was not the patience of someone who didn't feel things. It was the patience of someone who felt things deeply and had decided that the feelings did not get to run the show, that the best response to a situation is rarely the first one, that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful one. She understood that Caroline had watched Elliot, the way she watched him, not because she disliked him, particularly. She was too pragmatic for dislike to be the point, but because she understood him completely, and what she understood was that he would eventually reveal himself so clearly that even Sloane, who had learned to look away, would not be able to miss it. She had just needed to make sure the architecture was in place for when that happened. She understood that bringing Bethany to the funeral had been Elliot's miscalculation, but it was the kind of miscalculation that can only happen when a person has spent years believing themselves to be the smartest one in every room. He had mistaken Sloane's stillness for defeat. He had mistaken her mother's grace for weakness. He had looked at two quiet women and seen easy marks, and it was the last wrong read he had made in the Whitfield family's direction. The thing about quiet people, the thing Elliot had never once understood, is that the silence is not empty. It is full. It is full of watching and thinking and building and preparing. It is full of the long, patient accumulation of everything that will eventually matter. Loud people mistake it for absence. They mistake the waiting for not knowing. They mistake the stillness for surrender. They are almost always wrong. In June, 4 months after the funeral, Sloane walked into the main conference room at Whitfield Capital for her first full board meeting as majority stakeholder and acting chair. She wore a charcoal suit, her mother's color, she'd always thought, and she was carrying a leather portfolio that had been her mother's, worn soft at the corners from years of use. The board members were mostly people who had known Caroline, who had watched Sloane grow up in the hallways of this firm, who had, she was aware, wondered in the months since Caroline's death whether Sloane would be up to it, whether she was the right person, whether someone who had spent the last 8 years adjacent to this place rather than inside it had the weight for what it required. She sat down at the head of the table. She let the room settle. Then she opened the portfolio, looked at the first item on the agenda, and said, "Let's begin." It was not a remarkable thing to say. It was not a speech, not a declaration, not a performance. It was just the next thing, said clearly, by a woman who had been preparing for it her entire life, without knowing exactly when it would come. The room listened. It always does, when the right person finally speaks.